Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to welcome the Acting Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russ Vought. This is a fitting topic for this subcommittee's first budget hearing of the year because OMB oversees the implementation of the President's agenda and prepares the President's budget. That budget offers a chance for this administration to lay out in detail its vision and priorities for America. Unfortunately, it's hard to imagine being more frustrated by what OMB has delivered this year. The budget deeply slashes programs that support the most vulnerable among us, the sick, the elderly, the poor, while doubling down on a discredited economic policy that widens the inequalities in our society. Overall, the budget cuts non-defense discretionary spending by 9% in 2020. To get there, it slashes programs that working and middle-class Americans rely on for bare necessities like food, transportation, medical care, and housing. As justification for these cuts, the budget cites the pressing need to cut deficits and stabilize the national debt, conveniently forgetting that the deficits are ballooning right now because of the tax cuts for the wealthiest. As a reminder, this administration has claimed and continues to claim that its 2017 tax cuts will pay for itself and more. Yet, Goldman Sachs, hardly a liberal bastion, concluded that it would add as little as 0.3% to GDP in 2018 and 2019, and could be slightly negative in 2020 and beyond. And the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the tax cut bill will increase the total deficit by almost $2 trillion over the next 10 years. To pay for this, the President breaks his promise to the American people and cuts as much as $1.5 trillion out of Medicaid and $500 billion from Medicare, while once again calling for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. In short, this budget puts the price of these tax cuts for the rich squarely on the backs of hardworking, regular Americans. And it gets worse. The budget relies on gimmicks, false savings, and unsustainable assumptions to cover up the full impact of its disastrous policies. For example, the budget makes extremely unrealistic economic growth assumptions to mitigate the true impacts of its policies on the deficit. It estimates that the GDP will grow by roughly 3% each and every year over the next decade. That is a full percentage point higher than most serious economic experts believe is possible. And according to the President's own economic report, that growth is contingent on even more tax cuts and non-existent increases in infrastructure spending. The budget also relies on a so-called two-penny plan to further reduce non-defense discretionary spending to 27% below the 2019 level. It hardly can be called a plan. The budget doesn't spell out any of the hundreds of hard choices that would be necessary to cut spending that drastically, and it's completely unrealistic. Meanwhile, OMB asks other agencies to make drastic cuts, but is hardly willing to do so itself. It proposes a cut of less than 1% after accounting for funding it shifts elsewhere or that aren't part of OMB's core responsibilities. On defense, the budget rejects the long-standing principle of parity and once again avoids making hard choices. Rather than making a workable proposal to increase budget caps for defense and non-defense spending in tandem, the budget uses sleight of hand to sidestep the issue entirely. The administration makes no adjustments to the budget caps. Instead, it proposes, quite unapologetically, to get around them and bump up defense spending by 5% by increasing the overseas war fund to the tune of $100 billion. And I quote Mr. Mulvaney, "If appropriations come across with any OCO money hidden in it, I'll do everything I can to strip it. It's a slush fund and a gimmick, and our own budget called it a backdoor trick last year." Politico, 4/30/2015. The budget also proposes $5 billion of additional funding for a border wall that Congress and the majority of the American people have already rejected. Despite all this, fantastical growth numbers, unrealistic cuts, and numerous gimmicks, the administration still fails to balance the budget by the end of the decade, a standard set by Republicans when deficits will still exceed $200 billion. This budget strays so far from reality, in fact, they'll really have no choice but to disregard it entirely. We'll continue to exercise the power of the purse to benefit all Americans, even if the administration doesn't seem interested. Finally, it would be remiss if I didn't mention frustrations by the way OMB has conducted its management and oversight work. OMB doesn't just prepare the president's budget. It clears regulations and testimony and oversees government-wide policies and initiatives. Yet this administration, officials at multiple agencies have committed repeated and egregious violations of ethic rules and other government regulations, costing taxpayers potentially millions of dollars. We don't have enough time to mention all the questionable spending decisions appointees have made on travel, office renovations, and furniture. We also continue to be concerned about the general lack of transparency and responsiveness from this administration on ethical and budgetary issues. Agencies continue to complain to us that their reports, testimony, and questions get routinely stuck in the OMB clearance process. This subcommittee provides significant budgetary resources to OMB to help address and improve these and other government-wide policies, and it is aggravating to only see the problems get worse. I look forward to discussing these issues in more detail. Before I turn to the acting director, I would like to recognize Mr. Graves for his opening remarks.